Thank you for joining us today. Whether you are a photo history expert or an interested newcomer to the field, I hope that this presentation will have something for you. The mission of the Clements is to provide resources for the study of American history. These resources didn't always include photographs. When we began acquiring great 19th century manuscript collections in past decades, many of these included early photos, some of which you will soon see. This was the beginning of the photo collections at the Clements Library. In the 1980s, under the direction of John Dan, the library began actively acquiring visual materials of all kinds, including American photography. A critical mass was achieved with the donation of the wide-ranging Frederick P. Currier collection in the 1990s, followed by the massive David Tinder collection of Michigan photography, the Mark Anderson collection of postmortem photography, and more recently the Richard Port Jr. collection of Native American photographs. At present, the photo collection of the Clements Library surpasses 150,000 images spanning from the 1840s into the mid-20th century. As a research library, we are seeking content-rich images that have something to say about the people, the places, or the events that they depict. We are not collecting artistic images the way the University of Michigan Museum of Art does. However, along the way, we have acquired some marvelous representations of the art of photography at its peak. You'll see some of these today. We are currently living in a world that is saturated with photographs on our phones, our computers, televisions, billboards, buses. We're communicating right now through a form of digital photography. As hard as it may be, I'd like you to try to imagine the world without photographs, just to have a sense of the impact that the very first photographic images had on our culture. The origins of photography are fascinating and complex. The brief version is an awareness of the photosensitive properties of silver dating back to the early 18th century. Early experiments were done with stencils laid onto paper treated with silver nitrate and silver chloride, and the use of the camera obscura, an artist's optical drawing tool, to focus an image from nature onto these various light-sensitive surfaces. All of this quietly took place in Europe and Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with varying degrees of success at producing an image directly from nature. The challenge was in retaining the image, fixing it so that it wouldn't disappear when exposed to light for viewing. In 1839, practical photography arrived suddenly in the public consciousness in the form of two different methods, both using silver as the basis, methods that had been developed independently by people working, for the most part, unaware of each other. They were the Englishman William Henry Fox Talbot and the Frenchman Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre. Talbot perfected a process using thin paper sensitized with silver salts to produce photographic negative that could then produce a positive print. He called his patented process the Talbotype. Daguerre and his partner Niépce Niepce used sensitized metal plates in a direct positive process called the Daguerreotype, which became public domain in France when the rights were purchased by the French government through the Académie des Sciences. As far as I know, the first mention of any of this in American news is this little article in the Corsair of April 13, 1839. It appears to be an excerpt from Talbot's proposal for the National Academy of Sciences in Britain. In it, the editor speculates as to what the effect of this new art will be, relating it to the impact of lithography on engraving, while Talbot himself attempts to describe the indescribable, nature drawing itself with detail and vivid accuracy. Talbot had heard the rumors from France of Daguerre's achievements and hustled to get a patent on his process. Talbot anticipated a long use for his invention on into the future. He stated, "What I have hitherto done, I do not profess to have perfected an art, but to have commenced one, the limits of which it is not possible at present exactly to ascertain." In the United States, little notice was given to the early reports of Talbot's pencil of nature, or rumors of Daguerre's images frozen on mirrors. A few years prior, the United States had seen what was perhaps the greatest journalistic hoax of all time, the reporting on the discovery of life on the moon by the popular daily paper, the New York Sun. Were these new sun pictures just another hoax? But by the late summer and fall of 1839, the news from France was accompanied by the French Academy des Sciences report on the daguerreotype process and published instructions by Daguerre on exactly how to do it. American inventor and artist Samuel B. Morse returned from Paris earlier that year, stating that he had met Daguerre, had seen the evidence, and the results were truly amazing, quote, "one of the most beautiful discoveries of the age." It was not a hoax. It was an extraordinary moment in visual culture. By September of 1839, an Englishman living in New York, D.W. Seeger, had somehow acquired a copy of Daguerre's manual, made himself a camera, and produced a successful daguerreotype of St. Paul's Church on Broadway by simply following the written instructions. Although nowhere near as widespread in use as the daguerreotype, early American photographers did experiment with the Talbotype and similar processes as well. Some paid the licensing fee and bought the instructions from Talbot. Others just learned how to do it and did it without paying the fee. The Talbotype process had a few advantages, one of them being low cost of materials, all of which could be produced by the photographers themselves. The other was the ability to produce multiple copies from a single negative, an important factor if you were in it for the money. Clements has one original Talbotype from the camera of William Henry Fox Talbot himself. It is from the Frederick P. Currier collection. Talbotypes are prone to fading, as this example has. If you can imagine a thin, translucent piece of paper treated with a bath of silver nitrate, exposed in a camera and chemically fixed. Where the sunlight coming through the camera lens hits the silver salts on the paper, it darkens. Shadows leave the silver salts unchanged to be washed away by the fixer. This makes a negative image. When sandwiched with another sensitized paper and exposed to the sun, you get a positive print like the one here. From one negative, you could produce hundreds of positive prints and distribute them widely, or use them as book illustrations as Talbot did. This is a salted print photo of John McAllister of Philadelphia, produced using Talbot's method, or something very much like it. McAllister was an important figure in American photo history himself. He was an optician who made corrective eyeglasses and scientific equipment in Philadelphia. When the first generation of American photographers had read Talbot and Daguerre's instructions on how to make a camera, several went to McAllister's shop to have their lenses made. This photograph was taken by Frederick Gutkinst, one of the big names in 19th century portrait photography. It has always surprised me how sharp these prints from paper negatives can be. I saw a fine exhibit at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. that featured both paper negatives and positive prints side by side. I was impressed with the sharpness and the clarity of the image. In America, it was really the daguerreotype that dominated photographic galleries. This was due to the vivid detail that is possible, the public fascination with the material presence that a daguerreotype has as an object, and the fact that the process was unlicensed and free. Today, we measure digital image quality by pixel dimensions. A high-resolution digital image may be several thousand pixels per inch. This determines the resolution possible for that image. On a piece of sensitized paper, like Talbot used, or a conventional photographic film, the grain or the level of detail is determined by the density of the silver scattered across the surface of the transparent film. On a daguerreotype plate, the sensitized surface is solid silver. The pixels are essentially at the molecular level. This gives an almost unlimited potential for image detail. The limits of the image quality then become the quality of the lens, which was very high in the early days, as lens crafting was hundreds of years old by the time of photography. The skills of the photographer with the lighting and the chemistry, and the ability of the sitter to hold still for a few seconds to get the exposure. If all of these elements come together, the result can be spectacular even by today's standards. At this point, I'd like you to take a leap of faith and follow along with me. This is the interior of a typical photographic portrait studio of the 19th century. Some of the elements that you will see include large windows and skylights for the necessary natural sunlight, plus drapes and reflectors to control that sunlight when it becomes too intense. There are special posing chairs with head clamps to hold the sitter still for the long exposures. The camera itself is probably a large wooden box camera on a tripod or a pedestal in the center of the room, and the requisite sleeping dog in the corner. This blurry image, I'd like you to believe, is also the interior of a typical 19th century photographic studio. Like this picture, it has a lot of the same elements. It has a large window off to the left, and with some imagination you can see out that window and across the street to some storefronts on the other side. In the center of the image is a box camera on a pedestal. You get a sense of a ceiling, a floor, of being in a room. This blurry image, of course, is a reflection. In the eye of the subject of a daguerreotype of a young man with an intense gaze. The full size of this daguerreotype is no more than 3 inches across. This is why people like me get the goosebumps when viewing early photography. The quality of the images is just unsurpassed even by today's standards. Some of you will want to know what the earliest photograph in the Clements collection is, and it might be this one. One of the characteristics of very early daguerreotypes is a certain flatness in the tonality. And one of the motivations for releasing any invention into the public domain is that it opens wide the possibility of improvement by many others. This was certainly the case with the daguerreotype, and American photographers pioneered advances that quickened exposure times and improved image quality. One of the most significant advances in early daguerreotype photography occurred in the mid-1840s with the discovery that a daguerreotype plate treated with gold chloride expanded the tonal range and added a pleasing warmth to the colors, important for portrait photography especially. This example occurred before the gold toning of plates was commonplace. In early photography, not much is accidental. It was too much work and expense to set up the pose and take the picture. So you can presume that the elements of these early portraits are deliberate. This gentleman wants us to know that he is a man of purpose. He's holding a tool, likely an engraver's burr or stylus. Here's another very early example. According to the research of our late friend Dave Tinder, the first evidence of a photographer in Michigan were advertisements in Detroit newspapers for an unidentified Daguerrean taking portrait photos in a hotel room in October of 1841. The advertising continued in Detroit papers until July of 1842 at another location. The gentleman pictured here is Eber Brock Ward, destined to become Michigan's first millionaire, shown along with his wife and infant son. At the time that this was taken, Ward was captain of a steamboat, the Huron, that traveled a regular schedule between Port Huron and Detroit. The donor of this great image, Leonard Walle, identified a manufacturer's hallmark on the corner of the plate that was in use for a limited time in 1842. Michigan photos from the 1840s are super rare. I know of just a very few, none dated before 1842. You'll also note Mr. Ward has brought with him a drawing of his steamboat, the Huron. Questions often come up about exposure time. It is something of a myth that it took a very, very long time to capture a daguerreotype image. Yes, it was certainly true in the experimental era up to 1840, but soon the plate sensitivity had been advanced through chemical treatments to result in exposure times of 3 to 20 minutes depending upon light conditions. By 1845, exposure times were down to 5 to 20 seconds. This example is one of the most instructive that the library has, and we frequently bring it out for classes. Although we don't know who the subjects are, who the photographer was, or where and why it was taken, we can still deduce a lot from the content of the image alone. In this era, portrait photography was serious, cost some money, and was not yet a spontaneous everyday occurrence. In a good example, everything is carefully and deliberately composed. The style of the brass mat on this one is a clue as to the date, which was probably about 1845. A close examination of the image reveals several things. We can see that these children's arms are linked, indicating a close relationship, probably kinship. He has a book, apparently a child's drawing or picture book. And there is a third person in the picture. The girl is holding a daguerreotype, an image of a bearded man, one could presume their father. Whomever he is absent from their lives at the moment that this picture was taken. From here, we can begin to speculate about various scenarios that fit these facts. This example is also a demonstration of the role of photography in social events like weddings and funerals. One of the many ways that our society differs from that of the 19th century is the way that we confront or avoid confronting death. When death was more frequent, often occurring in the home, familiarity was greater. Rituals of mourning were more established and included the keeping of remembrances, including photographs. In many cases, a post-mortem photograph, such as this example, may be the only photograph existing of the subject. This striking image was taken by top-rank Philadelphia photographer Marcus Root for the wealthy Lamb family. Harriet Lamb's funeral was extravagant and well documented in the family papers at the Clements Library, and it includes the original receipt for this picture from Marcus Root. The cost was $10, which was quite a lot for that time. When the great daguerreotype collector Mathew Eisenberg came to the Clements many years ago, this image and the accompanying documentation lit his fire more than anything else we showed him. Mathew loved it when a complete narrative could be built around an early photographic image, and this one has it all. Self-portraits and self-referential photos are always fun and very collectible. This one is a rather unique self-promotion. I am imagining that this image may have once been displayed in a frame with other examples of Mr. Hoag's work at his gallery. Most early daguerreotype cameras reversed the image from left to right. He may have written that signboard backwards so that it would be right reading in this final image. Photography has an important presence in African American history. At a time when American visual culture was replete with derogatory, racist images, photography offered the chance for self-representation that declared human dignity and asserted a rank within society. We know very little about this couple other than that they were associated with the Crittenden family of Kentucky and California, who were Confederate sympathizers. Photography was a career path that a number of free African Americans followed. Among the more successful were the Goodridge brothers of Pennsylvania and later Saginaw, Michigan. The Goodridges were active in documenting the lumbering boom of mid-Michigan as well as running a portrait gallery in East Saginaw. It is interesting that their clientele was almost exclusively white. Although I've seen many examples of their work, I have only seen one of a black person that wasn't part of their immediate family. This daguerreotype by Glenalvin was taken prior to their move to Michigan, which was prompted by a racist persecution in Pennsylvania. Their story of tragedy and success is well told in a book by John Jezierski, published by Wayne State University Press. In the Daguerrean era, taking pictures outdoors in the landscape meant bringing a lot of equipment and chemistry with you. Major scenic attractions like Niagara Falls offered photographers a chance to show off their artistry, but also to sell some images to tourists. Among the American technical innovators of the daguerreotype was Thomas Martin Easterly of Vermont, and then later St. Louis, Missouri. Easterly had an artist's sensibility for dramatic landscape composition and delicate portraiture. His technique, whatever it was, allowed him to push his exposure times to just a few seconds. In these examples, he has frozen the leaves on the trees and captured a figure in a pose that would be very difficult to hold for more than a moment. Additionally, he has captured something that was almost impossible in the Daguerrean era, clouds in the sky. The daguerreotype plates were far more sensitive to the warm red-violet side of the visible spectrum and didn't respond to the cool blue side. This set of 4 framed plates came from a well-documented trip to Niagara in 1852. Easterly's traveling partner was the English photographer John Wurge, who published a detailed memoir years later. This set was donated by Alice Dodge Wallace, a descendant of Dr. Norton Strange Townshend, whose papers are at the Clements. Thomas Easterly was Norton Townshend's brother-in-law, and many of the Townshend family photos were taken by Easterly. I got to know the collector and scholar Leonard Walle in the reading room of the Clements Library. He was going through the Townshend family photos and matching the faces to those examples that he had in his own collection. He discovered that a group of Easterly daguerreotypes that he had acquired included Townshend family and this lovely pair of Townshend's in-laws, Miriam and Thomas Easterly. This is daguerreotype portraiture at its highest level. The hand tinting is very delicately done at a time when many Daguerreans were heavy-handed and clumsy. Thomas Easterly is a fascinating story. He refused to surrender to the newfangled, cheaper, faster, more popular photographic processes that made the daguerreotype obsolete in the 1860s. He was a terrific artist, but a lousy businessman, and he continued to offer daguerreotypes decades after the public had lost all interest. The Whittemore-Low family papers is an extensive collection of family and military correspondence comprising the papers of at least 5 generations of related families. Included are important daguerreotypes, paper photographs, and photograph albums. In part, The collection pertains to the Civil War service of Captain William Whittemore-Low, who was commander of the gunboat Octorara serving the West Caribbean blockade during the Civil War. The photographer's imprint burnished into the velvet liner on the case identifies this daguerreotype as coming from the Broadway, New York gallery of Mathew Brady. Brady of Broadway was the preeminent portrait photographer of his day. The best examples of Brady's portraits share the expressive qualities of light and shadow of old master paintings. Every era comes up with some kind of virtual reality technology. This is a stereoscopic 3D image a la 1852. Experiments with stereography predate photography. It was not difficult to devise a camera with two lenses that could produce two images. These two, not quite identical images will blend back into one three-dimensional image when viewed through the special viewer that unfolds from the special case. Composite images like this class photograph were made by rephotographing a bunch of daguerreotypes. You can see that each plate has two people side by side together on a horizontal format. With one exception, there's one gentleman who was by himself on the same format. These were probably tacked to a board along with the title sign on the left and then rephotographed in multiples. It's my guess that everyone in this picture received a copy of this daguerreotype. Daguerreotypes of daguerreotypes may be more commonplace than we know. It can be difficult to know unless you have one along with the original. The lenses of early box cameras reversed the image, which is why these two face in opposite directions. Here's another example of someone who wants us to know his station in society. The saw and the plane make clear that John Appleton is a carpenter. John Appleton was the carpenter that built this house in Brighton, Michigan, which still stands. It's downtown on Grand River Avenue. That intensely blue sky is the natural effect of overexposure in a daguerreotype plate. This, coupled with the warmth of gold toning, gave tantalizing hints at the potential for a full-color daguerreotype, and several daguerreans invested their careers in experiments in full-color photography, with very limited success. This one is a personal favorite of mine. The young woman here is indicating a relationship with another young woman who looks an awful lot like herself. It didn't take long for photography to look back upon itself as a subject. I mentioned the great collector and scholar of Michigan photography, David Tinder, who passed away in 2016. His collection is at the Clements due to the generosity of David Walters and many other donors. Among the very first photographers to do business in Michigan, whose name we know, is James Martin of Detroit. He can be tracked through business directories and other sources. Dave Tinder died never having seen an example of his work. A while back, Leonard Walle, a longtime friend of Dave Tinder's, came by the library and said he wanted to make a donation to be added to the Tinder collection. This is it. And in the bottom right corner of this marvelous image, there is a small printed label. The label makes clear why Len Walle wanted to donate this to the Tinder collection. So Dave, if you're listening, you've got your Martin daguerreotype now. This is such a great example. I love the long curls on the young girl's hair. And there's another photograph in the package. It's a tintype, probably taken 8 or 10 years later, of the same girl. The tintype was a new process, unlike the Talbotype or Daguerreotype. It was a wet plate collodion process that triggered an explosion of cheap photographs in the 1860s. But that'll be the subject of another presentation at another time. There are a lot of resources and publications out there, far too many to list, but I encourage you all to learn from other enthusiasts, collectors, scholars, and curators through the organizations like the Daguerrean Society and the Michigan Photographic Historical Society. You can revisit the examples in this presentation by going to the Clements Library Image Bank. You can find individual catalog records describing the details of them in the online catalog, and there's plenty of other photos and photo albums described in our finding aids. Thank you very much for listening.